This pain is not yours. Introduction. There are moments in life when pain arrives without warning, and we cannot trace it to anything we've done, seen, or lived through. It's as if it has always been there, woven into the background of our thoughts, our relationships, our bodies. We feel broken, but we don't know why. Welcome to the Middle Book. Today we're bringing you a powerful and thought-provoking summary of It Didn't Start With You, a journey into the heart of inherited trauma and healing, the groundbreaking work by Mark Wolynn. It is a journey through the unseen world of inherited trauma, a journey that will help you understand how pain can be passed down across generations, living on in the form of anxiety, depression, chronic illness, fears, or emotional disconnection. What if your suffering didn't begin with you? What if it began decades ago, in a life you never lived, but whose consequences still echo within you? In this audiobook, Mark Wolynn shares his own story of losing his vision, plunging into depression, and seeking healing across the world, only to discover that the answers were rooted not in distant lands or spiritual retreats, but in the one place he had tried to avoid the most: home. The healing, he learns, begins by reconnecting to the emotional truths of his family, his mother, his father, and the invisible losses carried through their lives. Wolynn draws from his own clinical experience and integrates insights from family constellations therapy, epigenetics, neuroscience, and the unique power of language. He reveals how keywords, like helpless, ruined, alone, can act like emotional GPS markers, tracing us back to unresolved traumas inherited from parents, grandparents, or even great-grandparents. This audiobook will guide you through his story and the stories of others, helping you reflect on your own patterns and the language you use, often unconsciously, to describe your life. It will invite you to look into the spaces between words, into the moments of silence in your family history, and find the emotional truths that still influence your present. You may encounter pain, but you will also encounter hope. Because this is not just a book about trauma, it is a book about healing, deep, transformative healing that begins when we dare to feel, to ask, and to listen. You are not alone. You are not broken. And more importantly, this pain is not yours. But the healing? We hope this summary brings you insight and value. If it resonates with you, please give it a like and share it with someone who might need it. Chapter 1. The Hidden Story. Let me ask you a question. What if the anxiety you felt for as long as you can remember wasn't yours? What if that sinking feeling, that panic, that deep, unshakable fear wasn't something you developed, but something you inherited? Most of us are taught to look at our own lives for the cause of our emotional pain. We comb through childhood memories. We dissect our relationships. We search for trauma in the usual places. But what if the answers we need lie further back, so far back that we weren't even alive when the story began? That was a truth I didn't discover through a textbook. I learned it through crisis. I was 34 when my life began to fall apart. On the surface, everything seemed fine. I was successful, I ran a business, I had a relationship, I had plans. But beneath all that, I was being eaten alive by fear. A fear I couldn't name. A fear that seemed to come from nowhere. It lived in my chest, just beneath my ribs. It showed up in my thoughts, it pulsed behind my eyes. And then, it took my sight. The first time it happened, I was at my desk. A shadow slid across my field of vision, like a curtain being pulled. It wasn't painful, but it was terrifying. My vision blurred, then bent. The room twisted. I panicked. I stumbled for the phone, dialing 911 by memory. I told them I couldn't see. That moment would become the pivot point of my entire life. The diagnosis was central serous retinopathy, a rare and poorly understood eye condition. Fluid was leaking beneath my retina. My vision was fading. And worse still, the doctors didn't know why it was happening. They couldn't tell me if it would stop. They couldn't tell me if it would spread. They couldn't fix it. They just told me to hope for the best. But hope at that point felt like a cruel joke. I wasn't just scared. I was unraveling. My thoughts spiraled into worst-case scenarios. What if I go blind? What if I lose everything? What if I can't take care of myself? What if no one helps me? What if I end up completely alone? At first, I thought I was just reacting to the shock. But the fear didn't fade. It deepened. It wrapped around me like vines, squeezing the air out of my chest. And that's when I began to notice something even more disturbing. The intensity of my fear didn't match the moment. Yes, losing your vision is terrifying. But this was ancient. It was like a flood of emotion I'd been holding back my entire life that had finally broken through the dam. I felt like I was drowning in feelings that didn't belong to me. That's when I began to wonder if they didn't. I tried everything: supplements, clean eating, acupuncture, faith healers, meditation marathons. I chased gurus across continents. I changed countries like outfits. I read sacred texts and slept on floors. I fasted, I prayed, I begged. And still, nothing worked, or at least not in the way I needed. The darkness in my mind stayed. My chest stayed tight. My body stayed on high alert. One day, after another long retreat, another meditation in silence, another attempt to find enlightenment, a teacher looked straight at me and said 7 words that changed everything. Call your parents. Go home. Heal there. I wanted to scream. That couldn't be it. I didn't come all this way to be told to call my mum. I wasn't here to be sent backwards. I had outgrown them, moved past them. I had replaced my parents with wiser, more awakened role models. Or so I told myself. But I couldn't get those words out of my head. Go home. What could that possibly solve? As I sat with it, reluctantly, something began to surface. A memory I had buried. A moment I had dismissed. The image of my mother's embrace, a gesture I had always pulled away from. The way my chest would tighten when she hugged me, the way I'd recoil. I always thought I was just not affectionate. But what if that reaction was a symptom? What if the body keeps secrets the mind has forgotten? And so, I did something I never expected. I went home. What I discovered when I did changed me forever. You see, what I learned, what shook me to my core, was this. Some of the pain we carry isn't personal. It's ancestral. It's inherited. The stories we don't talk about. The grief we don't express. The secrets we keep buried. They don't disappear. They don't dissolve. They find ways to live on, through us, through our fears, our behaviors, our illnesses, our broken relationships. I started to see it clearly, my fear of being helpless, of being ruined, of being alone. These weren't just mine. They were echoes of unspoken stories from my family, echoes of my mother's pain, my father's silence, my grandparents' losses. As I began to explore these echoes, I uncovered a history of heartbreak I'd never known. I learned that 3 of my 4 grandparents had lost a parent before the age of 10. I learned that my mother had been hospitalized for weeks when I was just a toddler, during the critical period when a child forms attachment and security. I learned that my father had been a Marine, a construction worker, and a man who never really knew how to say, "I love you," but tried to show it with acts of quiet presence. Suddenly my own pain made sense. The feelings of abandonment, the fear of being alone, the chronic anxiety, they weren't rooted in my adult life. They were embedded in my earliest relationships. And further still, they were layered into the DNA of my family. And here's the part that may surprise you. As I reconnected with my parents, awkwardly, clumsily, and vulnerably, my symptoms began to shift. My body softened, my mind calmed, my vision began to return. It wasn't a miracle, it was biology, because science now tells us what the soul has always known. Trauma doesn't end with the person who experiences it. It lives on, encoded in our nervous systems, passed through behaviors, emotions, and even genes. And healing it? That begins with seeing the full story. That's why I wrote this book. Not to tell you that you're broken, not to offer a quick fix, but to invite you to look deeper, to look beyond your own life and into the emotional inheritance you may be carrying. This isn't just a personal journey, it's a human one. We all belong to families. We all come from long lines of people, some of them brave, some of them broken. Some of them are nurturing, and some are absent. All of them are human, and all of them left something behind. Sometimes what they leave behind is love. Sometimes it's pain. But here's the gift. You don't have to pass it on. The pain you carry may not be yours. But the healing, that part is yours alone. This book is your invitation to begin that healing, to recognize what you've inherited, to release what no longer serves you, reclaim the joy, connection, and peace that is your birthright. So I'll ask you again, what if the pain you carry isn't yours? And what if your healing could ripple backward through time, bringing peace not only to your life, but to the generations who came before you, and the generations still to come? Let's find out together. Chapter 2. Where the Pain Begins. There's a strange kind of loneliness that creeps in when you realize your suffering has no clear origin. It's the kind of loneliness that asks, if this didn't happen to me, why does it feel so real? Why does it hurt so deeply? After I returned home and began reconnecting with my parents, the questions I had been avoiding for years began to rise to the surface. They didn't come in the form of answers, but in memories, in sensations, in moments of discomfort I had long suppressed. I started to notice that the feelings I had always labeled as anxiety or fear had a language of their own, a rhythm, a shape, a voice. Sometimes they came as sudden panic. Other times it was a quiet numbness, but always they pointed to something deeper than I had been willing to admit. I didn't know where these emotions truly came from, and so I began to listen, not just to my thoughts, but to my body, to the flinches, the tightness in my jaw, the way I held my breath around certain words or names. I began to write down phrases that seemed to rise out of nowhere during moments of fear. Simple, haunting words. I'm not safe. I'll be abandoned. I'll lose everything. Over time, I started calling this my core language, not because I had invented it, but because it had always been there, buried in the silence. One day, while talking with my mother, I asked her if she remembered anything significant happening during my early years. She paused, thoughtful, and then casually mentioned that she had been hospitalized when I was about 1.5 years old. She had undergone surgery and stayed in the hospital for nearly 3 weeks. I don't remember any of it, of course, but my body remembered. The tension I had felt when she hugged me, the fear of closeness, the distrust of connection, it all began to make sense. Somewhere in my infant nervous system, the message had been encoded. She left. You can't rely on her. Don't get too close. It's remarkable how early our emotional wiring is shaped. Even more remarkable is how much of it is passed down unconsciously. As I explored more of my family history, I uncovered even more pieces of the puzzle. My maternal grandmother lost her mother when she was just 7. My paternal grandfather was raised without a father, who died in an accident before he turned 3. These were not just tragic stories. They were blueprints, imprints of loss, abandonment, and grief that shaped the way love was given and received in my family. I began to see how trauma doesn't just affect the person who experiences it. It ripples outward, reshaping generations. When pain isn't spoken of, it doesn't disappear. It lodges in silence. It becomes the background hum of a family's emotional life. It becomes the unexplained anger, the sudden panic, the irrational need for control, and often it becomes the thing we think is wrong with us, when in fact it's the residue of something much older. There's a phrase I once heard that struck me to the core. What isn't expressed is impressed. When grief is not grieved, it gets stored. When fear is not faced, it gets buried. And the burden is passed on, not through words, but through behaviors, through nervous systems, through emotional DNA. You can see it in a father who never touches his children because he was never held. You can see it in a mother who panics whenever her child is late because she carries the unspoken terror of a sister who died young. You can see it in the child who has night terrors without ever hearing a single scary story, and the child doesn't know it's not theirs. The first time I truly understood this, I wept. Not from sadness alone, but from a kind of relief I had never known. There was nothing wrong with me. I wasn't broken. I was simply carrying stories that had never been told, I was the expression of grief that had never found its voice. And that meant finally I had the power to change it. Healing inherited trauma isn't about blaming. It's not about pointing fingers at our parents or grandparents. It's about acknowledging reality, about seeing that love and wounding can coexist. It's about realizing that our ancestors did the best they could with what they knew and what they had. And it's about choosing to feel what they couldn't. To finish the sentences they never got to speak. To finally bring into light what lived for too long in shadow. Somewhere along this path, I understood something else. We don't only inherit pain, we inherit strength. We inherit resilience. The very fact that I was still standing, still searching, still capable of love despite the fear, that was proof that healing wasn't just possible. It was already beginning. So when people ask me where the pain begins, I tell them, it begins where love was interrupted, where connection was broken, where silence took the place of truth. But that's not where it ends, because the pain may not be yours, but the choice to heal, that is entirely up to you. Chapter 3. The Language of the Body. Before I learned how to truly listen to people, I had to learn how to listen to myself. Before I could listen to myself, I had to learn to listen to my body. Not to my thoughts, those were loud and constant, but to the subtle language of my muscles, my breath, my posture. It turns out the body has a voice all its own. And if you get quiet enough, if you get curious enough, that voice begins to speak. In the early days of my healing, I would sit in silence and just observe. No goal, no technique, just stillness. What I discovered was startling. My shoulders were always tense. My breath was shallow. My hands trembled slightly, even when I wasn't nervous. I clenched my jaw so tightly at night that I cracked my molars in my sleep. These weren't random reactions. They were stories, memories, warnings. At first I ignored them. I treated them like annoying side effects, physical nuisances that would go away if I just focused hard enough on getting better. But they didn't go away. They intensified. And only when I stopped fighting them did I realize they weren't the enemy. They were the message. The body remembers what the mind forgets. And more often than not, the body isn't reacting to what's happening now. It's reacting to what happened then. That moment, you were left alone. That time, you were told to be quiet. That time, you learned it wasn't safe to cry or to need or to speak the truth. The body holds onto those moments like frozen snapshots in time, waiting for a chance to release them. I remember sitting in a workshop with a woman who had struggled with panic attacks for over a decade. No therapy or medication had given her lasting relief. She was skeptical about being there, skeptical of me. But when we began exploring her language, those words that surfaced in the middle of her panic, she began to soften. "I can't breathe," she kept saying. "I'm drowning." The words were familiar, but they had always seemed metaphorical to her. When I asked if anyone in her family had ever drowned or had breathing issues, she paused and then said almost casually, "Well, my grandmother died in a house fire. She suffocated before help arrived." Her breath caught in her throat as she said it. At that moment, she realized something she had never considered before. Her panic attacks weren't just about stress. They weren't just about fear. They were reenactments, unconscious relivings of a trauma she had never personally experienced. Her body, in its own way, was trying to keep that memory alive, trying to make sense of it, trying to resolve it. This kind of thing isn't rare. In fact, it happens more often than we realize. Our bodies are brilliant. They know how to adapt, how to survive. But they don't forget. They encode. They absorb. Unless we consciously intervene, we end up reacting not to reality, but to the emotional imprints left behind by someone else's story. Sometimes that imprint comes in the form of words, what I call core language. Other times it shows up in sensations, a tight chest, a lump in the throat, an aching stomach, a hollow in the chest. These feelings seem irrational, even embarrassing, but they are incredibly intelligent. They're not proof that you're broken. They're proof that something inside you is asking to be heard. When I work with people, I often ask them not what they're thinking, but what they're feeling in their body. The answers are always revealing. A man might say he feels a pressure on his chest that started after his father died. A woman might feel numbness in her hands every time she tries to speak up at work. A teenager might report a strange buzzing in his head whenever he gets close to someone emotionally. These aren't just physical sensations, they're guides, they're clues, and when we follow them with compassion, we often uncover the root. One of the hardest parts of this work is getting people to trust what they feel. So many of us have been conditioned to override our bodies, to push through the pain, to hide the tears, to pretend everything is fine. We become experts at managing symptoms instead of decoding them. We take pills, distractions, jobs, relationships, anything that lets us bypass what's really going on. But healing doesn't happen when we bypass. Healing happens when we turn inward, when we slow down, when we ask, what is this sensation trying to say? For me, the real breakthrough came when I stopped demanding that my body stop hurting and started asking why it hurt. Why did my chest tighten every time I thought about the future? Why did my stomach ache every time I went home? Why did my legs shake during the silence? The answers weren't always obvious, they didn't come all at once. But over time they came, in fragments, in images, in flashes of memory. And slowly, the noise of fear began to fade. Not because it was gone, but because I had finally started to understand it. It takes courage to listen to the body. Because it doesn't lie, it doesn't perform, it doesn't care about appearances. It cares about truth, and truth, even when it's painful, is always the beginning of healing. There is a part of you that already knows what you need to feel, to say, to release. There is a part of you that remembers everything. It may not speak in words, it may not shout, but it's there, waiting, whispering. And the moment you stop to listen, really listen, you may find that what you thought was broken is actually trying to become whole. Chapter 4. Stories We're Born Into. There's a strange intimacy that forms between us and the stories we've never heard. Even if no one told us, we seem to carry them. We feel them in our bones. We act them out without knowing. We find ourselves walking through emotional landscapes we've never personally traveled, somehow intimately familiar with the terrain. I used to think that what shaped us was only what we experienced directly, that our personalities were molded by childhood, by choices, by what we remembered. But the more I listened, to others, to my own body, to silence, the more I realized there are stories written into us before we ever speak a word. Stories passed down, not through bedtime tales, but through biology, silence, and survival. We are born into emotional blueprints. Some of them are beautiful, others are fractured, but all of them are real. When I began tracing my own patterns, my fear of abandonment, my panic around illness, my overwhelming need for control, I couldn't find a cause in my own memories. Yes, there were small moments that contributed. Times I felt unseen, unheard. But the intensity of my responses didn't match the scale of those experiences. It felt like I was reacting to something much older, something inherited. So I did what many of us never think to do. I began to look backward, not just into my own life, but into the lives that came before me. It started with my grandparents. I asked questions I had never dared to ask before. I listened to stories I had only half heard in family gatherings. What I uncovered was both heartbreaking and illuminating. My maternal grandmother had lost her mother as a child and was sent to live with relatives who treated her like a burden. My paternal grandfather had been drafted into war and came back a different man, quieter, more distant, never able to hold his children the way he once imagined he would. No one in my family talked about these things. They were considered the past, things to be buried. But pain doesn't disappear just because we pretend it's over. It lingers, it seeps. And if left unaddressed, it looks for someone to carry it. Often, that someone is the child, or the grandchild, or even the great-grandchild. I started to see how trauma skips and lands, how it can remain unspoken for one generation, only to burst forth in the next. A grandmother loses her mother and never learns how to nurture. Her daughter grows up never feeling truly loved, and doesn't know how to express love to her own child. And that child, me, feels an inexplicable emptiness that no amount of affirmation seems to fill. That's the cycle. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. At first I felt angry. Why hadn't anyone told me? Why hadn't my parents explained their pain? But that anger didn't last. It softened into something else, something deeper, compassion. Because the truth is, most of them didn't know either. They didn't know they were carrying grief, fear, abandonment. They didn't have the language for it. They only had habits, emotional reflexes, and a deep, unspoken wish that their children would somehow live a better life. Many of them tried to protect us by hiding their pain, but pain doesn't stay hidden. It leaks. It spills over in moments of silence, in the way a parent withdraws when you cry, in the way love is given but never said, in the way affection is rationed, as if it's too risky to give too much. And we, as children, don't question the history. We simply internalize the emotion. We make it about us. We assume we're the problem. I remember one woman who came to a workshop and broke down while describing her overwhelming fear of being left behind. She couldn't form close relationships. She always kept one foot out the door, expecting to be abandoned. When we traced her family history, she remembered something. Her father had been adopted, but never spoke about it. She had no details, only a single photo of him as a baby in an orphanage. That photo had haunted her for years. Through the process, she began to realize that the fear she carried wasn't just hers, it was her father's. The infant fear of being left alone, the wound of being given away, the grief of not being chosen. Her body had picked up that signal and carried it into adulthood, trying to guard her from a pain she never personally experienced. This is how inheritance works on an emotional level, not through logic or intention, but through resonance. We inherit the unfinished, the unresolved, the unnamed, and in doing so, we are invited, though not obligated, to bring healing where others could not. There is a power in seeing your story in this way, not as a singular path, but as a thread in a much larger tapestry. You begin to understand that your reactions are part of something ancient, something human. You begin to make space for your emotions instead of fighting them. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to rewrite the story. It doesn't require confrontation. It doesn't even require forgiveness, not at first. It begins with recognition, with naming, with curiosity. What happened in my family? What did they survive? What did they never get to express? And what am I doing with that legacy now? The healing begins when we make what was once unconscious, conscious. When we decide not to keep carrying what was never ours to begin with. When we look at the old pain and say, I see you, but you don't have to live through me anymore. We are the turning point, the place where silence ends and story begins. Chapter 5. Listening for what was never said. Healing doesn't begin with understanding, it begins with listening. And not the kind of listening we're taught in school or at work. I'm talking about a deeper kind of listening. The kind that happens when you turn down the volume of the world and tune in to the frequency of what's been waiting inside you all along. There were years of my life where I thought I was listening. To others, to myself. But I wasn't. I was analyzing, solving, trying to fix things that felt broken. I'd hear someone say they were sad, and I'd respond with advice. I'd notice fear in my body, and I'd immediately look for a way to escape it. I treated feelings like problems to be solved, not messages to be understood. That all changed the day I realized some of my most intense emotions weren't mine to fix. They weren't even mine to begin with. They were echoes, resonances of grief, fear, and loss that had traveled through my family's history and settled in my chest, waiting to be heard. The first step toward healing was learning to be still enough to hear them. At first, it felt uncomfortable, even dangerous. I'd sit in silence and feel the familiar flutter in my chest, the heat rise in my face, the restlessness in my legs. Every part of me wanted to move, to get away. But slowly, I learned that the discomfort wasn't an enemy. It was a doorway, a passage into something deeper. I began to ask myself different questions. Not how do I get rid of this feeling, but what does this feeling need me to know? That shift changed everything. One night, while lying awake with a tight knot in my stomach, I whispered a question into the silence. Whose pain is this? I wasn't expecting an answer. I just wanted to ask. But then, almost like a memory, I saw an image in my mind. My grandfather, alone in a hospital bed, his eyes searching for something that would never arrive. I had never met him. He died before I was born, but I had heard bits and pieces of his story. A hard man, they said. Not very emotional. Liked his whiskey more than his children. But in that moment, what I saw wasn't hardness. It was loneliness. A depth of isolation that no one in my family had ever spoken about. And suddenly, I understood something. The loneliness I had carried my entire life wasn't just mine. It had a history. It had roots. That experience opened a new door for me. I started working with others not just to help them understand their symptoms or their behaviors, but to help them listen to what had never been said. Often, it started with a single sentence, something they heard themselves say over and over without knowing why. I don't belong here. No one ever sees me. I always mess things up. These weren't just complaints. They were fragments, clues. When we traced these fragments, we often found they didn't originate in the speaker's life. They were inherited, passed down through generations of silence. One woman came to me saying she couldn't understand why she panicked whenever someone said goodbye. Even casual goodbyes made her chest tighten and her breathing quicken. As we explored her history, she remembered a story her mother had told her only once. When her grandmother was a child, her own mother had left one day and never returned. No explanation, no goodbye, just gone. That kind of loss doesn't vanish with time. It doesn't dissolve because a generation has passed. It imprints, it shapes, and when it's never spoken of, it can live on in a granddaughter's breath, in the panic she can't explain when someone walks out the door. So many of the people I've worked with carried stories like that. They didn't know them consciously, but their bodies did. Their hearts did. They reacted to events with a kind of intensity that didn't match the moment. That mismatch is the signal. It tells us something else is speaking, something older, something that's waited a long time to be named. I've come to believe that the stories we never tell are the ones that shape us the most. They live in the way we flinch when someone raises their voice, in the way we shut down when we feel vulnerable, in the way we overperform, overgive, overthink, just to feel safe. And if we never stop to listen, we pass those stories on. Not with intention, but through repetition, through the emotional patterns we model, through the reactions we normalize, through the fears we never name. But here's the good news. Listening changes things. Truly listening, without judgment, without rushing, without the need to fix, creates space. Space for the story to unfold, space for the silence to soften, space for the wound to be witnessed. And witnessing is where the healing begins. There's a kind of magic in being seen, not in a performative way, but in a soul-deep way. When someone listens to your pain with presence, when they don't try to change it or explain it away, something shifts. The pain begins to loosen, the story begins to breathe. You can give that gift to yourself. You can be the witness your ancestors never had. You can sit with the grief they swallowed, the fear they buried, the love they withheld because they didn't know what else to do with it. You can listen, not for answers, but for presence. You can say, I hear you. And sometimes that's all the wound ever needed. To be heard, to be known, to be honored. What has never been said still lives somewhere inside you. It doesn't need to be solved. It doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be spoken, finally, into the light. Chapter 6. The Emotional Code. There's a quiet language we all speak, though few of us realize it. It's not taught in school. It doesn't follow grammar rules or logic. But it's there, in the pauses between our words, in the way we repeat certain phrases, in the emotional fingerprints we leave on every relationship we touch. I've come to call this the emotional code. It's the inherited language of trauma, the patterns we unknowingly replay because we don't know we're carrying someone else's script. This language often begins with simple, haunting words. I'm not enough. Something bad is going to happen. I'll ruin everything. We whisper them to ourselves in moments of vulnerability. They arise suddenly like old ghosts. They feel familiar like thoughts we've always had. But what if those phrases aren't your original thoughts at all? What if they're echoes from the lives of people you've never met? When I first began paying attention to the words that came up in my lowest moments, I was shocked by their consistency. They weren't random. They were precise, almost ritualistic. It was as though my mind returned to them like a prayer, but a prayer rooted in fear. At first I dismissed it. Everyone has negative self-talk, I told myself. But something about the way these phrases lived in me, how easily they came, how deeply they struck, made me question their origin. One day, while sitting with my father, I asked him if he had ever felt like a failure. He looked up from his coffee and nodded slowly. All the time, he said, even when I was doing everything right. I asked him if he'd ever said anything like, I ruin everything. His face changed. He looked at me like I had read his diary. That's the exact phrase, he said. How did you know? I didn't, not logically, but somewhere in me I did, because I had been repeating his words without ever hearing them from his lips. His story had become my story. His pain, translated into a sentence, had rooted itself in my nervous system, and I had been living it as if it were mine. That realization changed the way I understood language, not just spoken language, but the internal scripts we live by. Our emotional code is shaped by more than personal experience. It's shaped by family, by culture, by secrets, by survival strategies passed down across generations. We internalize them not because they're true, but because they feel familiar. In my work with clients, I began asking them to write down their most painful thoughts, the sentences that repeated in their heads during moments of stress, panic, or grief. Almost without exception, those words traced back to someone else. A mother who was shamed for expressing need. A grandfather who lost everything and never trusted joy again. A father who always braced for loss, even in love. These weren't just family patterns. They were verbal fingerprints carried silently through generations. It's easy to dismiss these phrases as just negative thinking, but when they come from a deeper place, they hold clues to the emotional wounds we've inherited and never examined. A woman once told me that every time she felt happy, a voice in her head whispered, "Don't get used to this." She thought it was just her anxiety, but when we traced the voice back, she remembered that her mother used to say the exact same thing after every good moment. Her mother had grown up during a war, where every ounce of joy was followed by loss, and so the phrase became a shield, a way to never be caught off guard by grief. But what protected one generation can imprison the next. The armor that once helped a parent survive can become the cage that keeps their child from fully living. When we inherit their language without context, we inherit their fear without understanding it. So what do we do with these phrases? How do we decode an emotional language we never consciously learned? The first step is noticing, catching the phrases as they arise, writing them down without judgment, treating them not as flaws but as fossils, fragments of history waiting to be unearthed. The next step is curiosity. Whose voice is this? Where did this belief begin? Does it belong to me or to someone who came before? And then, perhaps the hardest step, compassion. Not just for ourselves but for the source, for the parent who didn't know any better, for the grandparent who lived through loss too big for words, for the ancestors who did the best they could with the tools they had. Compassion doesn't excuse pain, but it allows us to soften toward it, to see it not as a monster to fight, but as a message to understand. I began replacing some of my own inherited phrases with new ones, not affirmations that felt fake, but truths that felt possible. Instead of, "I ruin everything," I said, "I'm learning to trust myself." Instead of, "I'll be abandoned," I said, "I'm allowed to stay." These weren't magical fixes, but they were steps, rewrites, new lines in an old script, and slowly the script began to change. We don't get to choose the emotional code we're born with, but we do get to choose what we do with it. We get to listen, we get to question, we get to rewrite. And in doing so, we don't just heal ourselves, we begin to heal the story that shaped us. The language of trauma may be old, but the language of healing is always being written, word by word, choice by choice, moment by moment. Chapter 7. The Turning Point. Every healing story has a turning point, not always a grand moment or a dramatic scene. Sometimes it's as quiet as a breath, as small as a pause before reacting, as simple as choosing to stay present instead of retreating. But in that pause, everything shifts. It doesn't fix what happened, it doesn't erase what was inherited, but it changes the trajectory. It says, this pattern stops here. I'm not passing this on. For me, the turning point didn't come with a revelation. It came with a breakdown, a moment when I could no longer pretend that I was okay, no longer hide behind what I had built. I had spent years constructing an identity that looked fine from the outside, successful, composed, capable. But inside I was exhausted. I wasn't just tired from the pace of life. I was tired from carrying so many stories that didn't belong to me, stories of failure, of abandonment, of shame, stories I had absorbed as a child thinking they were mine, but they weren't. They were scripts written in my family's bloodline, passed down with each generation's silence. It was during a particularly low night that I found myself sitting in the dark, no phone, no distractions, just my breath and a heavy ache in my chest. And something inside me finally cracked, not in a destructive way, but in a necessary way. I whispered to no one in particular, I can't do this alone anymore. I wasn't even sure who I was talking to. Maybe it was my ancestors, maybe it was the younger version of myself, maybe it was just the universe. But at that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. Not because the pain was gone, but because I had finally stopped pretending it wasn't there. That was the beginning. From that night on, I began choosing differently. I began telling the truth, not the edited version I used to protect others, but the messy, uncomfortable truth. I began admitting when I was scared, when I didn't know what to do, and when I needed support. And slowly, people around me started showing up differently, not because they had changed, but because I had stopped hiding. One of the first conversations I had was with my mother. For years, I had avoided real connection with her. We spoke, of course, we exchanged pleasantries, but beneath it all was a wall I had built brick by brick. I told myself she wouldn't understand, that it was too late, that some wounds were better left untouched. But deep down, I missed her. I missed the possibility of something real between us. So I called her. Not to accuse or to fix, but simply to share. I told her I had been struggling, that I had been carrying pain I didn't understand, that some of it felt like hers. There was a long silence on the line, and then she said with a tenderness I hadn't heard in years, I think I've been carrying pain that wasn't mine too. That moment didn't erase the years of distance between us, but it created a bridge made not of answers but of honesty. That's what healing often looks like. Not resolution, but reconnection. Not closure, but opening. An opening to feel, to speak, to sit with what has been avoided for generations. I began to see how so many of my relationships were shaped by inherited dynamics. The friend I always tried to rescue, mirroring my mother's role in her family. The partner I never trusted fully, echoing my father's distance. The teacher I idolized, mirroring the longing I had for approval I never received as a child. These patterns weren't random. They were recreations, unconscious attempts to resolve the past through the present. But the present is not the past, and no amount of reenacting will bring us the healing we seek. Healing comes when we stop reenacting and start remembering. Remembering who we are beneath the layers, remembering the truth beneath the coping, remembering that we are not only the result of pain passed down, we are also the beginning of something new. That understanding changed how I saw the people in my life. I stopped seeing them as threats or saviors and started seeing them as mirrors. Mirrors of the parts of myself I had disowned, mirrors of the fears I had inherited. And in seeing them clearly, I began to see myself more clearly too. There's a moment in every healing journey when you realize you have more power than you thought. Not power to control others or prevent pain, but power to respond differently. Power to feel without fleeing. Power to stay present in discomfort. Power to say no. Power to say yes. Power to love without disappearing. And in using that power, you change the story. The pain that once seemed like a curse becomes a guide. The fear that once kept you small becomes a teacher. The lineage that once felt heavy becomes sacred. We don't choose the family we're born into. We don't choose the wounds we inherit. But we do choose what we do with them. We choose whether we stay asleep or wake up, whether we repeat or repair, whether we carry the pain forward or lay it down and walk a different path. The turning point is not a place you arrive at. It's a choice you keep making every day, every moment. Every time you decide to listen instead of shut down, to stay instead of run, to speak instead of swallow your truth, that's the turning point. And the beauty of it is, it's never too late. No matter how long you've carried the pain, no matter how deeply it's rooted, the moment you choose to meet it with presence and compassion, the story begins to change. Maybe you've already had your turning point, or maybe it's still ahead. Either way, know this: you are not alone in this journey, and the moment you begin to walk it consciously, something ancient in your lineage exhales, because the pain didn't start with you, but the healing can. Chapter 8. Inheriting Strength. When we talk about inherited trauma, the focus often lands on the pain, on the wounds passed down, the silence that shaped us, the grief that never had a voice. And while those are very real parts of our lineage, they are not the whole story. If trauma is passed down, so is resilience. If fear can live in our bones, so can strength. If we carry our ancestors' sorrows, we also carry their courage. The very fact that we are here, alive, and seeking healing means that someone before us endured enough to make our life possible. That matters. It's easy to overlook this when we're deep in our pain. When you're untangling years of emotional weight, the last thing on your mind might be gratitude. I understand that. For a long time, all I could see was what had been withheld, the love that was inconsistent, the touch that never came. These were the words I needed, but didn't receive. It felt unfair, and it was. But in time, something shifted. I began to see not just what was missing, but what remained. My grandfather, who was emotionally distant, worked tirelessly to put food on the table. My grandmother, who rarely expressed affection, lived through the sudden death of her mother and still managed to raise children. My father, who struggled to say, "I love you," never missed a moment to show up when it really counted. And my mother, who carried her own wounds, still found ways to nurture life and beauty in our home. None of them were perfect. None of them were free from their own ghosts. But within them lived a thread of endurance, of devotion, of the quiet determination to keep going even when the road was hard. Recognizing this didn't erase the pain, but it brought depth to it. It made it possible to see my family not just through the lens of what they lacked, but through the lens of what they gave despite it. Perhaps even more importantly, it helped me see what I had inherited beyond their fear. I began to feel a kind of awe at the sheer force of survival it must have taken to bring me here. Somewhere in their silences was a scream they couldn't afford to let out. Somewhere in their stillness was the choice to keep loving, even if they didn't know how to express it. That awareness changed me. Sometimes, when I work with people who feel deeply broken, I ask them to look at what they've survived. Not to glorify suffering, but to highlight strength. A woman who grew up with constant rejection, but still shows up for her children with open arms. A man who never knew what safety felt like, but created it in his own home. A person who inherited generations of scarcity and still finds a way to be generous. These are not accidents. They are expressions of strength that were passed down too. Sometimes quietly, sometimes painfully, but passed down nonetheless. Our ancestors didn't just pass us trauma, they passed us grit. The ones who kept going through war, through migration, through poverty, through heartbreak. They didn't just leave wounds, they left wisdom, they left instincts, they left blueprints for rebuilding. The resilience we carry isn't just emotional, it's biological. Studies in epigenetics don't only show that trauma leaves chemical marks on our genes, they also suggest that those marks can include adaptations for survival. Our nervous systems are not just sites of damage. They are systems that learned how to keep us alive. That hypervigilance you sometimes curse may have once been a life-saving reflex. That sensitivity you see as a flaw may be the very thing that kept your lineage alert to danger. That fire in your chest, that drive to protect, that unwillingness to give up, it's not just personality, it's heritage. And when we start to recognize this, something beautiful happens. We stop seeing ourselves as damaged goods. We start seeing ourselves as sacred carriers, bearers of a lineage that includes both heartbreak and heroism. We stop fighting our emotions as enemies and begin honoring them as information, as inherited messages trying to guide us toward healing. I remember a man in one of my retreats who said he had never felt like enough. No matter how hard he worked, he felt inadequate. We explored his history, and he shared that his grandfather had grown up during the Depression, a time of scarcity, survival, and desperation. He never rested, the man told me. He worked until his body gave out. I guess I picked that up. But then he paused and said something I'll never forget. Maybe his voice telling me I'm not doing enough isn't trying to hurt me. Maybe it's trying to make sure I don't lose everything like he did. That shift in perspective didn't make his inner critic vanish, but it gave it context. It turned a tormentor into an ancestor. And that made all the difference. The strength we inherit is often disguised. It's buried beneath the fear, the dysfunction, the misunderstanding. But it's there, in our capacity to feel, in our longing to heal, in our refusal to give up on love, even when love has been complicated. And once we recognize that strength, we can begin to build with it. We can use it to make new choices. We can pass it forward, reshaped, refined, redeemed. Because that's the final truth about inheritance. It flows in both directions. Yes, we inherit from those who came before, but we also shape what we pass to those who come next. Every time we break a silence, every time we choose connection over avoidance, every time we soften instead of harden, we are changing the legacy. Not by erasing the past, but by giving it a new ending. This is what it means to be the turning point, to stand in the middle of the river of our ancestry and say, I carry all of this, and I choose to honor it, transform it, and pass on something stronger. The story of your family doesn't end with the trauma. It continues with the healing, and in that continuation, your strength becomes part of the inheritance too. Chapter 9. Living the Healing. There comes a moment in every journey of healing where the focus shifts. No longer are you just excavating the past, digging through the layers of grief and inherited sorrow. Instead, you begin to ask a new kind of question. How do I live now? How do I take everything I've discovered and carry it with me into the rhythm of my days? How do I embody the healing I've worked so hard to reach? This is where the real work begins. Not in theory, not in reflection, but in the ordinary moments that make up a life. Healing isn't something that happens once and then remains complete. It's not a destination you arrive at, where everything is suddenly light and easy. It's a way of moving through the world, a relationship you build with yourself over and over again. For a long time, I thought healing meant never feeling broken again. That if I did it right, if I followed the steps, if I felt deeply enough, understood clearly enough, I would be free of the pain forever. But life isn't like that. Feelings return, patterns resurface, and when they do, it doesn't mean we've failed. It just means we're alive, we're human, and our stories are still unfolding. What changes is not the absence of struggle, but our relationship to it. We learn to meet discomfort with compassion instead of fear. We recognize our triggers not as proof that we're broken, but as invitations to go deeper. We see the old voices arise, and instead of obeying them, we pause, we breathe, we choose differently. Living the healing means recognizing that every moment offers a choice. Do I act from the wound or from the wisdom I've gained? Do I shut down or open up? Do I pass on the pain or begin to break the cycle? These questions are not answered once. They are answered daily, sometimes hourly. The most powerful expressions of healing often look small from the outside. Saying no without guilt, saying yes without fear, taking a breath instead of raising your voice, letting someone see you cry, asking for help, letting go of the need to be perfect. These moments might seem insignificant, but they are the foundation of a new legacy. One rooted not in pain, but in presence. I remember a day, not long after I had started this work more seriously, when I found myself standing in front of my mother. We were arguing about something small, something familiar, and I felt the old urge rising in me, to shut down, to withdraw, to protect myself with distance. That had always been my pattern, but that day I paused. I looked at her, really looked, and in her face I saw not just my mother, but the girl she once was. The girl who lost her own mother, the woman who carried more than she ever told me. And I softened. I didn't walk away, I stayed. We didn't resolve everything, we didn't have a breakthrough, but we shared something real. That moment, me choosing presence over protection, was a victory. Healing lives in moments like that, in the space between reaction and response, in the silence we once filled with fear, in the words we finally speak, and the ones we decide to stop repeating. Living the healing also means making space for joy. For so many of us, especially those who come from long lines of struggle, joy feels dangerous, like something that could be taken at any moment. We brace for the fall before we've even felt the rise, but healing includes joy. In fact, joy is one of the deepest signs of it. When we allow ourselves to feel pleasure, to laugh freely, to relax into connection, we are reclaiming something that may have been lost for generations. I often tell people that one of the bravest things they can do is let themselves feel good. Not because everything is perfect, but because joy is a birthright we've been taught to forget. Letting yourself be happy without guilt is a form of resistance. It's how we honor those who couldn't. It's how we change the script. And sometimes, healing is quiet. It doesn't always announce itself. You might not realize how far you've come until you find yourself in a familiar situation. And you act differently. You don't explode, you don't collapse. You hold yourself with kindness. You reach out instead of turning inward. That's healing, not flashy, but real. This work is not just for ourselves. It's for the people we love, the families we're building, the communities we shape. When we do the work of healing, we become safer people to love. We stop handing our wounds to others and start holding them with awareness. We become mirrors of what's possible, not perfection, but presence. One of the most beautiful parts of this process is watching how healing ripples outward. I've seen parents who, after learning to forgive themselves, are able to offer their children a level of love they never knew before. I've seen siblings reconnect after decades of tension, simply because one of them chose to stop repeating the old roles. I've seen people fall in love not from a place of need, but from a place of wholeness. And I've seen people live more fully, laugh louder, cry deeper, rest more freely. Because healing isn't just about fixing pain, it's about expanding our capacity to live. To live the healing is to choose life, over and over again. With all its mess and beauty, its grief and glory, it's to say, I may have inherited pain, but I will not be defined by it. It's to remember that you are not just a product of your past, you are a co-creator of your future. So when the old voices return, when the fear resurfaces, when the ache feels unbearable, remember this: you are not starting over. You are continuing. You are deepening. You are embodying the healing that your ancestors may never have known was possible. And in doing so, you are not just healing yourself. You are rewriting the story for everyone who comes after. Chapter 10. You are the legacy. If you've made it this far, if you've sat with the stories, the silence, the questions, the pain, and the breakthroughs, then you are already doing the work that changes everything. You are the end of a long line of survival and the beginning of a new kind of living. That matters more than you may ever fully understand. You are not broken. You never were. You are the living echo of love, pain, choices, and dreams that came before you. You are a bridge between what was and what could be. And in choosing to listen, to feel, to heal, you've already begun reshaping what will be passed on. Some people think legacy is about wealth, about names carved into stone or accomplishments listed in history books. But true legacy is something else. It lives in how we show up, how we love, how we speak when we're angry, how we stay when things get hard, how we raise our children, how we treat the people who remind us of our worst fears. True legacy is emotional, invisible but powerful. It travels through the nervous system, through touch, through tone, through truth. You are part of a living legacy, one that began long before you, and one that will extend long after. You are not the start of the story, and you are not the end. You are a chapter, but you are the first chapter who gets to write with awareness, with agency, with intention. That is a sacred role. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't need to be perfectly healed. There is no finish line here. What matters is that you are awake now. You are no longer moving through life on autopilot. You are no longer mistaking inherited fear for fate. You are no longer confusing someone else's pain for your identity. You have begun to tell the truth, even if it's still tangled, even if it comes slowly, even if some days the fear is louder than the clarity. That doesn't matter. What matters is that you're showing up differently, and that difference creates ripples, subtle but lasting. There will be moments still when you forget, when the old voices get loud, when the patterns resurface, when you doubt whether anything has really changed. That's okay. Those moments are not evidence of failure. They're opportunities to remember who you are now, to choose again, to return to your body, to breathe, to ground in the truth you've uncovered. That much of what you've carried was never yours to begin with, and what is yours can be met with compassion. You will be triggered, you will be tested, and when you are, you'll have tools now, not because I gave them to you, but because they were already inside you. All I've done is remind you to listen, trust what you feel, to believe in the intelligence of your emotions, the wisdom of your body, the language of your soul. And here's something else. You will inspire others without trying to, not by preaching, not by fixing anyone, but by being different, quieter in your reactions, softer in your judgments. Be clear in your boundaries, bolder in your self-love. People will feel that. They may not know what changed, but they'll feel safer around you, more seen, more accepted. That is how healing spreads, not like wildfire, but like warmth, like light slowly filling a dark room. Maybe you'll share this journey with someone close to you. Maybe you'll never speak a word of it. Both are okay. Healing is not a performance, it's presence. You don't owe the world a perfect version of yourself. You don't need to be someone else's proof of anything. You just need to keep showing up as who you are, imperfect, evolving, and aware. And as you do, remember this. Every time you choose to love without fear, you're breaking a pattern. Every time you choose rest over burnout, you're rewriting a script. Every time you say what's true for you instead of what's expected, you're making space for someone else to do the same. These moments are small, but they are seismic. This work is generational. Not because it has to be hard, but because it has depth. Because when we shift our inner world, we change what's possible for those who come after. We change the emotional climate of our families, our friendships, and our communities. We plant seeds of safety, of truth, of love that doesn't require perfection. So take a breath. Feel where you are right now. Maybe raw, maybe relieved, maybe cracked open in ways you didn't expect. That's okay. This isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of the next part, the part where you live fully and freely, with the knowledge that your pain does not define you, your past does not dictate your future, and your story is still being written. You are the legacy, not the pain, not the silence, not the wound, but the healing. And that, more than anything, is worth passing on. Epilogue, the quiet after. There's a stillness that follows healing. Not the absence of noise, but a deeper kind of quiet. The kind that lives in the spaces where tension used to be. The kind that grows when we stop running, stop fixing, stop pretending we are alone. This quiet is not empty. It's full of all the versions of ourselves we've finally made space for. The child who needed to be held, the adult who needed to be seen, the soul that waited, patiently, to be listened to. In this quiet, nothing has to be proven, nothing has to be perfect. There is only presence, and presence is enough. You may forget what you've read, you may lose track of the insights, the language, the names. That's okay. The work lives in your body now. It will return when you need it. It will speak up when you're ready, and you'll know how to listen. So when the world rushes, slow down. When old patterns whisper, breathe deeper. When fear shows up, greet it with kindness. And when you doubt your path, remember, just by choosing to heal, you've already changed the ending. Not every story gets that chance, but yours does, and that is beautiful.